All right, so welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Polly Papsnor from PMG, and this is our third training in our new training series, and it's actually Marvin Dawson's second presentation. And what I'm going to do is hand this over to John Bell in just a moment, but while I continue to invite or admit people, I just wanted to say that we have a big group today. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and John and I will be monitoring the chat. And if anything comes up where we feel like it makes sense for Marvin to address the question during his presentation, we will do that. Otherwise, we will do a follow-up with any Q&A that isn't answered during the session. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to John, who's going to introduce Marvin.
Great, thanks, Polly.
Sure.
And welcome everybody. If you've actually attended the last two, thank you very much, and welcome to number 3. If you are new to the training sessions, welcome, and we hope you'll continue on with us in the future. Just as a quick intro, my name is John Bell. I kind of run the sales efforts for MMI Direct, and Marvin Dawson, our speaker for today, runs the operations of MMI Direct. Marvin and I have been working together since the late 80s in 4 different organizations. Within MMI Direct, Marvin actually joined MMI in the year 2000 to build their customer service division. And then I followed Marvin along in 2001. And we've worked together again at MMI since then. Marvin has built 3 customer service divisions within his storied career, and is probably one of the most knowledgeable, if not the most knowledgeable person in the application of data processing in successful direct marketing programs. So even though we only have an hour today and there's a lot to discuss, Marvin is available as a resource to every single person who is in attendance today, and anyone else that you think might be appropriate with any questions or anything on a follow-up to this presentation. Feel free to reach out to Marvin or myself directly with anything we can do to assist you. And without further ado, let's get to Marvin, because I know there's a lot to cover. Take it away.
All right, thanks, John. Appreciate it, and welcome everybody. As John mentioned, we've been doing this for quite some time. As you can probably tell from my emoji, I'm a pretty old guy. I've been, I think I ran my first Merge Purge process back in 1976. So been doing this quite some time, been exposed to a lot of different processes, software companies, organizations, nonprofits, working very closely with them to try to find the perfect process that meets their needs. And as we'll discuss as we go through this, the Merge Purge process, data hygiene, a lot of people like to, will refer to it as a commodity, but that's definitely not what it is. It is definitely a specialty, and it's definitely something that, along with, yourself and your service providers, come together and make determinations on what's the best process for you and your needs and implement that strategy. So many of you, I believe, based on I'm seeing a lot of familiar names, were with us a few weeks back when I did the data hygiene process. And this is kind of what we're gonna go through today. On the Merge Purge side, we're going to revisit a little bit and recap some on the data hygiene stuff, and then we'll get into the acquisition Merge Purge strategies and process, look at some reports, talk a little bit about the post-merge processing and various steps and things that you might be doing there, along with some thoughts and recommendations that I might have regarding that to share with you. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about and go through. So we'll get started now. So what is a Merge Purge? In the simplest terms, It's a way to bring all the various names and addresses that you are ordering for your acquisition program, bringing them all together, cleaning them up, and the merge purge step is eliminating the duplicates. And we'll talk about, well, what is a duplicate? What type of merge process would you be doing to determine what a duplicate might be? So pre-merge, you're doing a lot of the data hygiene stuff, the things that are going to help you in terms of improving your deliverability, reducing your postage costs. And it also works in the strategy of it in terms of making sure that the merge purge and the subsequent processes after data hygiene work the best. And you're finding the most accurate duplications based on the business rules that you have set up and the files that you've got going into it to make the determination on what's a duplicate and what isn't a duplicate. And so those are the things that the hygiene process will have an impact on when you're doing your acquisition merges. Okay, Polly. Sorry. So here it was just a list of 8 different data hygiene checklist processes that we talked about a few weeks ago and things to do. And I just wanted to briefly show you these again. We're not going to go into the detail that we did the last time, but CAS and NCOA, National Change of Address, these are the types of processes that are licensed by the Postal Service and you must do to get any type of automated postal discounts. Some of these other hygiene processes that are listed here are not requirements to get any automated postal discounts, but they're definitely processes out there to help you identify and determine the most accurate, deliverable, and responsive name and address to mail to. And this was just a list of what those were that we talked about a few weeks ago. If you have questions as we're going along or would like for me to go back and revisit some of these in more detail, if you weren't on the previous one or you just like a little bit more explanation, then reach out in the chat room indicated and I can touch on it toward the end. Okay, so in the flow of an acquisition job, one of the things that happens prior to the data hygiene process is you've got all of these lists that are coming in from multiple places and all these different formats. You have your house files that you're using a suppression list, your active donors. You have potentially reactivation lapse names that you're inputting into the merge process. You have your rentals, exchanges, and all from outside lists, response lists, co-op lists, all of those lists that make up your mail plan for your acquisition job feed into this process. And one of the things that happens with all of these files coming in as part of the QC process is converting all the name and address data to a standardized format, and also carrying any other data that you may need subsequently for personalization or anything else on the back end, carrying that data as well, such as if you're putting in your reactivation odor lapse names as lists into your merge purge, you might have a donor ID tied to those and you want to keep that ID on the back end so that it gets personalized on the piece. You may have dates and dollar amounts within your house files that you want to maintain because you're going to build as strings potentially for the reactivation names based on their previous giving history. All of that type of thing happens up front with all these different files and all these different formats to standardize them into one common format going into the various processes. So this is just kind of a flow that shows you where that fits into the process. So again, back to the hygiene stuff that we talked about. A lot of that is making determinations and flagging records that might fall into certain categories that you would not want to mail to. So as an example, the deceased process. So you're running deceased, you're flagging those records, and you're making a determination based on a solid business decision based on testing that you might have done that made the determination, yes, people that are flagged as deceased, matching to these various deceased databases, we do not want to mail to them. NCOA moves with no forwarding address, that type of thing. So this is just these are all categories of potential records that you can identify that you do not want to mail to. And so
Marvin,
yes.
Marvin, a question was asked how often the deceased files that you get are typically updated.
On a monthly basis is how frequently the ones that we are utilizing are getting updated.
Marvin, could you, I just noticed, could you just go into a little more depth on temporary moves? I think it's a very interesting category.
Absolutely, absolutely. So a few years back, what the Postal Service did is on the NCOA National Change of Address database, they started flagging people that have reached out to the Postal Service and indicated, I'm going to move, you know, like the snowbirds, I'm going to move down to Florida for the winter. And so this is going to be my temporary address. Previously, that information did not appear on the NCOA database. Only permanent moves appeared on the NCOA database. So now you could indicate that it's a temporary move. Those records are flagged now. There's no new address that is provided, but they're flagged as indicated that the address that you currently have on file is an address. It's their permanent address, but they're not living there at this present time. They come off of that 30 days prior to them relocating back to their permanent address. So those records can be flagged. So as an example, if you are mailing within 30 days of your of the date that you run the NCOA process, a temporary move could be somebody that is not going to be at the address that you have on file. So you may want to consider not mailing to them. Or if you're mailing outside the 30 days, then there is a good possibility they may return, even though they're still flagged as a temporary move. So again, it's a way to identify people. And then what you do is you make a business decision on whether you want to mail them based on your mail dates and when you run, or based on a testing. You could flag these people and then mail them and then see how they respond in relationship to your normal response rate to make a determination on whether you should retain them or continue to mail them. I have a number of clients that if they're mailing within that 30-day window, then they are usually, then I'd say it's probably about 60-40 are dropping them, and the 60% are dropping, the other 40% aren't. And again, that's based on their own results and how it looked to them. People that run the NCOA more than 30 days prior to the mail date, and almost all of the cases that I've been working with, most of the times they're keeping the temporary moves on the file because they can potentially come, already be back home.
And again, there was a question in chat, and just to reiterate that these records are flagged within the NCOA process.
Yes, but no new address is provided. It's just
right.
Flagged as a temporary move, and as of the date we ran the NCOA, they're still on the database that way. Okay, so on to the unduplication strategy. How to basically tailor your merge purge process.
Marvin, can I? There is one additional question that came up that probably a good one to address. Is there a threshold for NCOA undeliverables? Often a record is flagged as undeliverable because it's missing a direction in an address, i.e. 900 Main Street instead of 900 South Main Street. Can that record be kept?
Yes, and basically what those are, what I refer to as potential Nixies. These are people that the Postal Service is deemed that the match is not exact enough to provide you with a new address, but the potential is there that they have moved, but it's not, but the match wasn't good enough to give you the new address. What I consider to be a true Nixie is somebody that you did match and you did, and they did fill out a change of address, but they moved with no forwarding address or they moved out of the country. That to me is a true Nixie. A potential Nixie are the ones where the match wasn't exact enough to provide the new address. Again, from a percentage standpoint on how many are like that, it's a fairly, I mean, I think there's 20 plus categories based on missing elements within the address that could have caused a potential Nixie, just like, a mismatch on a suffix, something of that nature. What I will say, I do not have, to my knowledge, I do not have any clients at present that are dropping potential Nixies. The testing that I've done with clients over the years has indicated that, they've kept those on file. And usually what you'll find in a lot of those cases, and you find this with people that are matching that receive a new address, if you're running PCOA, proprietary change of address, and the matching criteria is not as strict as it is by the Postal Service. In a lot of cases, PCOA will catch those potential Nixies and give you a more current address for those as well.
And just to reiterate, there was a quick follow-up. Did you say the temporary moves in the NCO are in the NCOA reports, but the temporary address is not provided?
Correct. That is correct. Basically, there's a footnote within the true Nixies of people that are considered temporary moves. And so they're counted as in that category, but they're ones that if you're mailing outside of 30 days, my recommendation is that you keep them, but again, it's something that you should test and make your own business decision about. Usually the quantities are fairly small. So it doesn't have a huge impact, and in lots of cases it may be so small, trying to read some results from it would be almost impossible. All right, great questions. Appreciate that very much. Anything else? Johnny?
You're clean.
All right, sounds good. So on to the first process.
Marvin, someone just asked if we're going to be sharing this deck afterwards, and yes, we are. We have some resources that we'll be sending out to everyone afterwards. So thank you. All right, Marvin, go ahead.
All right, so the Merge Purge. So setting up the process, understanding what those processes are, what we're going to kind of talk about right now. So Polly, we can move forward with this. So your list priorities. So within the Merge Purge, you have multiple lists that are going into the job. So when you're matching all of these various lists to one another, making the determination on when I find a match, which record do I keep from which list? And a lot of different things go into that. And I strongly recommend that and I'm sure you are having great conversations with your list broker, list managers that you're working with on making these recommendations and what list to order. Primarily what I normally see in most cases, that if you've got your suppression files on top, so any matches to your suppression files you're going to drop, they would be like your top priority. Any lapsed reactivation names, any house names would probably follow that, followed by your rented list. And within those groups, it's random allocation. But there's other things that you can consider in regards to the cost of a list. When you have, do I keep the record with the least cost, that type of thing, depending on what your arrangements are with your list broker and the list manager in relationship to this. So there's a lot of different ways to go when you're looking at which records to retain. But usually you'll always see that the house files are on top, followed by any of the rented lists. You may have other things if you're bringing in prior multi-buyers from previous jobs that you are allowed to mail again. They may fall into a different category than what your continuation list or your test list or your co-op list may get in terms of a priority. Okay. So the unduplication levels. So basically they're in the residential type merge. What you have are three different levels here: an individual match, a household match, or a residential match. And basically what that is, at an individual level, that is the exact same name and address would be considered a duplicate. At a household, that would be last name and address would be considered a duplicate, and a resident level is address only. So name does not even come into consideration. And one of the things I want to point out here, and there's an example, here with the names and addresses in terms of what level they would be considered or not considered a duplicate. But what I want to stress here with you is within the concepts of one merge purge process, you're not isolated to just choosing one of these. Depending on what you want to do, you can set different levels of matching at an individual, household, or a resident, depending on the list and the relationship that you want to have happen. I have it in a number of cases where I'll have on house names, because these are reactivation names, lapse names. These are people that you had a relationship with, and you may have had a relationship with more than one person within the household. So in that case, you may potentially want to mail to both of them when you're trying to reactivate them in somebody, because you had that relationship. And so when you're doing the merge and you're comparing your house reactivation names to one another, you might do that at an individual level. But when you're comparing your outside list to one another, these are individuals you've had no relationship with before. You might be looking at doing it at a household level because you only want one piece to get there at a household, and that household being basically same last name and address. Then if you get into situations where you only want one piece within a specific household, no matter what the name is, roommates, different last names, whatever, you might consider doing a residential merge purge, depending again on what your strategy is, what you've seen, what you've tested that works for you. But you're not stuck with just one type when you're looking at the relationships across the list. You can do different things all within the same merge process in terms of your matching. And you talk to your service providers, talk to us. We're doing that for you in terms of what might work best for you. We can look at results in terms of what that means as far as individual versus household. What I can tell you, and you'll see this, and I'll discuss it again when we're talking about multi-buyers, but usually in the scope of a nationwide mailing, and you have, all of the names that are matching to each other at a household level. Usually what I find is between 10, 15, 20% is the most I've seen where a different individual within the household existed. So in your multi-buyer grouping, which are records of all the records that are considered duplicates, and you retained one of those records, there was another record if you did it a household on about 15 to 20% of the time, which is a different individual. So that might give you some kind of idea in regards to what you might be looking at in terms of retention, duplication rates. And one thing I can tell you, making these types of changes or decisions in your strategy is something you definitely need to have conversations with your list broker, list managers about, because it has an effect on retention rates. And so if you're changing these things up, whereas you're going to find more duplicates, then you'll have less retention. So, making sure you've ordered enough names, because there are goals that you're trying to achieve in terms of what you want to mail. If you went from household to individual, then you're going to retain more names. So then you might not need to order as many names as what you have been previously. So it's just something to take into consideration if you're deciding to make adjustments to your strategy in terms of what you identify as a duplicate and how you would consider that. Okay. So match criteria, again, and at the individual, household, or residential level, when I'm comparing records to one another, what would I consider to be a duplicate? And I've got these three terms here: tight, medium, and loose. And basically, a tight criteria allows for few variations within the name and address. Medium will allow for a few more, and a loose will allow for even more variations. And the way I look at this is, it's like you want to assign a score to a group of records that you're comparing to one another. And let's say, an exact match is a score of 100. So if you're looking at a group of records to try to determine what is a duplicate, and another point I want to bring up is 90% of the records that you're ordering, especially from an outside list, and it's probably closer to 95%, the names and addresses are identical. There is no difference at all, hardly at all, within any of the way these names and addresses have been presented, because these are people that have given to various causes or across all these various lists. They've identified how they like to be communicated with, and they've shared that information with you as a donor to your organization, or they've shared that information to you as a donor or a customer from another organization. And so 90 to 95% of the records are the same. It's how you look at the other 10% where there's differences there to determine duplication. And usually what I'll see, and a lot of those variations fall into the records that are, I call the house file records or suppression records, depending on how records are gathered and put into databases as suppressions, as, if there are people that are reactivating that you haven't communicated with for a couple of years, all of that information. I usually see more variations of how data looks on that side than I do from the standpoint of from a exchange or rental standpoint, because the majority of organizations that are putting their names on the market for exchange or rental are going through all of pretty much the same processes. They're doing the NCOA data hygiene, address standardization, zip code correction, things of that nature. And so they're standardizing all of that address data prior to them getting put on the market for you to be able to, to rent or exchange from. So there are a lot of the same. A lot of those same types of things don't necessarily happen internally for a lot of internal databases, especially for older names. You're usually doing your selects and your NCOAing, and then, in-house mailings, things of that nature, and it might be doing a job for job. You're not constantly doing updates to your database in terms of getting rid of duplication that might exist there, standardizing a lot of information. You're doing that mostly with your more active names and not some of the older names. So dealing with those variations within those files, especially when you're dealing with house files and suppressions, like, major donor files, what you might look at to consider a duplicate when a major donor record appear in a suppression file, and you're looking to compare it to an outside list, then you might want to allow for a few more variations within the name and address for those to determine a duplicate, just because the last thing in the world you want to do is send, a major donor an acquisition piece when they just gave you $10,000 and now you're asking them for 50. So you might look at those types of relationships and make different determinations on what and how much variations you would want to have within a record to determine whether it's a duplicate. I hope that made sense. I felt like I was rambling a little bit, but I think that, it kind of goes back to the point of where you can adjust your logic based on the list to make that determination. So here's just some examples.
Marvin, if I can add something in real quick, just a good question came up in the chat again. Who determines the match criteria? Does the client have to include that criteria in the instructions? That's
a great question. And what happens within our organization is you sit down and you have conversations so that you learn the objectives and where the data is coming from, and you learn the objectives of your client and the mailer to make the best possible decision as it relates to that. And that is an ongoing process. So as an example, we're just doing a kickoff and we're talking about what suppression files are going into the jobs, what, your outside list, any reactivation names, what issues have you had in the past? Are you getting phone calls because such and such received a piece? And then when you look at it, you can see, well, there's some slight variations within how it appears on our databases as suppression, and this is a difference that it appeared in another. And you're constantly making those adjustments and tweaks based on the feedback. But you usually start from a base, and then you go from that. And it all happens in terms of conversations, making sure that what the objectives are of the mailer or what the way that you have the criteria set up. And that's how we approach it. And I would hope that that's how most service providers approach that as well. I've had some cases where in the past that there's been major donor files where they basically said, if the name matches, I want that record dropped. I don't care what the address is. I mean, and that's definitely major overkill, but it also eliminates any slight possibility of a major donor receiving an acquisition piece. So these are some examples, again, of the way names may come in and what would you consider a duplicate or not. I mean, if I look at the top two of mine where it's just and usually in the merge process, house numerics make a big difference in terms of whether a record is a duplicate or not. But if you've got if in those first two, 988 Cattails Drive and 989 Cattails Drive, both of them to Marvin Dawson, I would consider that a duplicate. But depending on how I have the criteria set up in the merge, if I had it too tight, that might not be considered a duplicate. Whereas, and I would take that as being one. So that's adding for some slight variations as it relates to that. Between Marvin Dawson and LM Dawsonville at 988 Cattails Drive and 9 Cat Drive, all within the same zip code, that's where you get into some more of the major variations within the name and address. And you might say, well, in the major donor file that I have as a suppression, when it's matching against anybody, I would want those two records to be considered duplicate. But for everybody else, I wouldn't. And that you can set that kind of criteria too. And you can make adjustments to it to make those determinations. Okay. So reporting, there's a lot of various reports that come out of the Merge Purge process. This is a standard Merge Purge summary report that'll give you a breakdown by list and in terms of what the input quantity was. And again, this is all the records have already been dropped that met the criteria based on your data hygiene. So those records are dropped, and this is just what's the input into the merge. And it gives a breakdown on the 3 different types of drops that you could have. Matches to a suppression file. A multi-buyer drop is matching across multiple lists. And a single drop is matching to the same list itself. Now, in this report, there's a hierarchy to how a record is counted. So I could actually be on a mailing list. I could also be on a suppression file. I could also appear on a second and third mailing list and then be on a 4th mailing list 3 or 4 different times. So my name appears 6 different times across all these variations, but when I'm looking at this summary report, I only get counted once. And so the hierarchy here is if I match to the suppression, no matter what else I match to, I get counted there. If I don't match to the suppression, but I match to another list and I get dropped, I get counted in the multi-drop. And then if I'm only on a single list and not on any other list, and I'm on there more than once, then I get counted in the single drops. So looking at this report right here, if you're trying to determine if there was a lot of list interaction across multiple lists or within the list itself, this report itself will not give you a complete picture of it. It'll give you a little snapshot, but not a complete picture. And there's another report, and we're going to get into that gives you this more information. But before we go there, also just want to indicate, different kinds of things that you, along with us or your service provider, should always be looking at in terms of these counts. Is there anything that looks unusual here? Is there any, did drop a lot of records that I didn't think, did I lose too many records for whatever reason? And you can look at this at a list for list basis to make that determination and see where you are losing the majority of the records. And then, is it something that is completely out of the norm? Am I running a monthly job and I normally retain 70% of the records almost all the time or within a few percentage points, and this time I only retain 50%? That is a red flag, or not, or just it's a flag that basically says, I want to recognize this and I want to understand, why did I lose 20% more records this time than what I've lost in the past? Could it be I just had a lot more names going in, and so there would be a lot more overlap? Did I order lists this time that were more geographic specific, which in those cases you would see a lot more overlap across that versus a complete nationwide type mailing? So understanding those, looking at those, having conversations about those with your provider and with your list broker, those are important things to understand and to know so that you can make good decisions going forward as to, why certain anomalies might possibly have happened.
Marvin, another question came up. Is there a reason one would put the house file after lapsed or non-donors, assuming house, lapsed, and non-donors are unique to each other?
So if I understand it correctly, and it's a great question, would I put my suppression files at a lower priority? Would I have my reactivation names that I want to mail and not have them bump up against the suppression files when I'm in the Merge Purge process? Am I stating that correctly?
I believe so.
Okay. There's a few different reasons to do that. And again, knowing your files and knowing where information, how information is gathered to create a suppression file. Let's just say that you've got one of your suppression files is the do not mail. These are people that have contacted you and said, do not mail to me. I do not want to receive any type of solicitations from you. That file right there, you would match to everybody. You would not, count that one as one. But if you've got an active donor file and you have a lapsed reactivation file, should your active donor file have a higher priority than your lapsed? It depends. I know people that they don't have the ability to remove certain names when they're pulling their suppression files, and they know that they will overlap with their reactivation names. So if they put the suppression file higher than the reactivation names, then it would wipe them all out. And so in that scenario, you're not going to match them to it because you didn't have the ability internally to distinguish between the two, or maybe they're being maintained at different places and you're not sure how to, that there could be overlap and you don't want to wipe everybody out. So there's, reasons, why that, you might do that, but under most circumstances, your suppression files, and again, it just depends on what the makeup of. If you only have one suppression files eliminator and it consists of all your current donors, plus your do not mails, plus your deceased, plus, whatever else makes up the criteria for your suppression files, and you cannot distinguish between those, then you almost have to put them above anything else as a suppression if you want to mail them, unless you know that this other house file that you're mailing to, you don't care whether they appear on another suppression file or not. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, well, I think one of the important things that's come out is the communication and communicating right. And the partnership with your service organization to come up with the best way to set up the criteria within your merge process.
Right. Another thing here too, and we'll point to it in another one of the reports is, you could potentially, looking at this report, you could have two lists within this report that matched each other 100%. And basically both of them, if they had the same priority, both of them retained a certain percentage of their names, and you would not be able to tell that from this. But on to the next report. Polly. The match analysis report, this is where you can make the determination. This is where it will count and keep track of matches and interactions amongst lists. So you'll see in this highlighted box here where it's got the 58.1%. These are two lists that have the exact same, it's the exact same list, but was a completely different select. So they had the 58% of the names that was on one list was also on the other for a different select. You should not have to pay for that being the same list. But, and so this report right here will show you some of those higher percentages in relationship to that. Let's say that there's a mistake made at MMI Direct, and we mistakenly took the same names from one list and converted it as two different lists. And they had the same quantities, and so it just wasn't something that was noticed, it was a mistake. And so we're running the merge process, and when I look at this report, it would show me 100% match rate. And then that's where you start going back. I can tell you some, stories relating to this is that I've seen this happen, and I haven't seen it necessarily happen internally, but I've seen where a large overlap or 100% overlap between two different lists that might come from two different places, their interaction with one another is 100%. And it just, and it was a mistake. It was a mistake made at, the place of fulfilling the list, but these kinds of things can happen. But this is where you catch this. This is where you determine that there's a problem here, and you go back and you start looking at it and investigating it to make sure that it's not an issue with the data. It's not that the data provided was invalid. It was just that it was possibly fulfilled incorrectly, like in this example that I showed you. And you make a determination. Do I mail those names? Do I keep them, or I just don't pay for them? That type of thing. But this report will give you that type of information to look at. Okay. Multi-buyer summary report. This is just a breakdown by list on where names that match to one another from different lists, and they're retained on a specific list. How many, in the multi-buyer report will give you their breakdown. How many did I have? How many were 2-time only, 3-time, 4-time, so on and so forth. And I'm going to assume that everybody is familiar with what a multi-buyer is based on what I said previously and just in doing your own job, but you have the ability to mail these records again. And a lot of people, a lot of mailers, what they do is they take their 2-time plus multis and they will do a follow-up mailing to them a couple of weeks after the initial mailing, or they will do the follow-up, and then they may take the 3-time plus and put them as another list going into the next acquisition job. You have the ability to do that. You've already paid for the names. You work this relationship with your list broker in regards to that. You can, you can mail these multi-buyers, 2 times. You can mail a second time, 3 times. You can mail 3 different times, a follow-up and a second follow-up, that type of thing. So this just kind of gives you that breakdown.
Marvin, in your experience, how far have people gone out as far as mailing the multis? Have they segmented off the 8-time multis and mailed them in an 8th mailing, or is there some limit that they are consolidated to?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one of I used to see that years ago, where people would do that, but the issue becomes also, and again, a conversation with your list broker, but in many cases, you're only allowed to deal with those multi-buyers over a 12-month period of time. So you're not, and again, this is a conversation with your list broker, because some people may have different rules, but usually you're dealing with your multi-buyers within 12 months. So you cannot go beyond. So unless you're mailing every month and you're going to pull your 3-time plus and then your 4-time plus, and you'll look at your report, you get down to your 8-time plus, you got I got 10 names, that I can mail 8 different times. It's usually not worth it. The most that I normally see these days is up to 4 times plus, is usually kind of where the breaking point stops in terms of how far out people will go. But again, years ago, I used to see it go a lot longer than that. But do I have an opinion as it relates to that? Again, your quantities start decreasing and decreasing on the 4 and the 5 times. And if you're putting these into another merge and they're a specific list, they are creating multi-buyers again. So let's say you take your 3-time multi-buyers and you put them in as a list going into your next acquisition. Those multi-buyers that match to any of the other lists, depending on, again, where you may have the priority at the very bottom. So the name is going to be retained on one of the response lists, but it definitely helped create another multi-buyer, potentially. That might not have been a multi-buyer before, because they might have only been on that one list, and then on the multi-buyer list, they might not have appeared on any of the other lists. Now, the likelihood of that being a 3 or 4-time plus multi-buyer from a previous job only being potentially a 1-time person in the existing merge is not extremely likely, but it could, it can happen. Okay. So ways to optimize your merge: your multi-buyer strategies, ask string optimization, removing non-responders. And I can see, based on the time, that I have gone on a little longer on some of these things, and I want to make sure that we try to get through all of this. I'm hoping as we go over, y'all will, most of y'all will be able to stay on. If not, I completely understand. So multi-buyer strategies. One of the things that you might consider doing is, as I mentioned earlier, you're doing a household merge purge. In many cases, there may be records where you're dropping and it's a different person within the household. So in this example, John and Mary were on 2 different lists. John was retained, Mary was dropped. John gets mailed the initial mailing, John gets mailed the follow-up mailing. Potentially, you can mail to Mary. So mailing the second in household on the follow-up or something that you might want to consider, or to try identifying that. Could that make a difference in your response for your multi-buyers? The only way to know is to test it. And I've seen results go both ways, where I've seen it have a slight increase and I've seen it not make any difference at all. So it is something that you could do if you wanted to, or to consider, or to try. And that's where you get into the 10 to 15 to 20% finding a different individual name within the household to mail in the follow-up. Okay, ask string optimization. As with modeling techniques and things of that nature, you can provide your files, and with the rented list where you have no giving history, you actually have the ability through many of these organizations that provide this service to provide, to get ask string groupings for outside lists based on giving history that they've done with other organizations, or buying history that they've had with other organizations. So it's another way to where you may have a static ask string, but you've got a lot of individuals within your file based on their giving history to other organizations, that you could be asking for a much higher ask amount for those individuals based on what they've done. And utilizing some of these modeling techniques to identify those records can do. You can also identify people that are more likely to give to a lower ask amount. And so whereas your bottom ask amount may be $25, you may have a group of people, if you're looking for these types of donors, and again, it depends on the type of donors that you're looking for. Would you want to consider asking less on these individuals? Is that the type of donor that you want? And so it's just another tool that you can utilize to try to increase your response and target a list of potential donors with ask string information that is based on giving history, just not with your organization. Remove non-responders. Chronic non-responder files are files that have been out there for years and years and years, and back probably 10 to 15 years ago, I had a lot more clients at that time that were utilizing this and looking at this information to make determinations on how frequently should I be mailing to an individual and still mailing to them when they continue not to respond. And the way to get to this information, I'll just take an example. Let's say that you've got 2 years worth of mailing data and 2 years worth of responder data. And then you look in and you're getting all of that mailing data and you're making, let's say that you mailed over 2 years, you mailed 10 million pieces. Of those 10 million pieces, that only represented 2 million unique households. So of those 2 million, how many times did I mail to certain ones? If in that 2-year period of time, the maximum number of times if I was mailing monthly with a follow-up would have been 24 times. So you can actually then take that, match your responders, determine how many times they were mailed before they responded, look at your response rates based on the number of times somebody was mailed, and then at some point you can say, okay, it's not profitable for me to continue to mail somebody that has been mailed 10 times or more based on the number of responses that I've gotten for people that have been mailed that much, along with how much that they donated and what was the cost to mail them that many times. That's what a chronic non-responder file is. That's how you can build something like that and make a determination at what point, and the business decision is, at what point do I say I'm going to stop mailing them? And am I just going to stop mailing them for a period of 6 months, a period of a year? How often am I going to stop, doing that before I maybe try to hit them again? That's just another way to look at that. Post-merge processes. This is a list of different processes that you go through to make, prior to, the piece in the mail getting delivered, that your service providers such as ourselves are doing, the key coding and assigning package splits and assigning seed names, upper lower casing, punctuation, assigning a prefix based on gender, salutation bills, finder numbers, postal discounting, logistics, things of that nature. So let's look at a few cases of this. So in key coding and package splits, this is where you assign a specific code that is usually representative. My apologies. Didn't realize, I thought I cut my phone off. You assign a unique source code, which is driven to that source code's assigned to a package that's assigned to a list. And this is kind of a report snapshot that would show you that particular package code, the source code, and the description and the count. When you provide split instructions, then this is the type of report that is produced so that you can make a determination that all names were split as you had requested them to be split. Seed names are names that are embedded in your mailing so that you can, people are able to track, when mail and when it's getting delivered. I know I'm seeded on a lot of various pieces. When you order lists or exchange lists from outside, seed names are inserted there so that the list owner can track to make sure that their list is not being used incorrectly and only being used as it was exchanged for or rented for, that type of thing. So that's what seed names are that get inserted in part of the mailing. Name and address formatting, this is just an example of upper lower casing, whereas when you're standardizing, the Postal Service's preference on address standardization is all uppercase. Not a requirement. You don't lose anything for discounts or anything like that if you went to upper lowercase. It's just the way that they prefer it. So this is just an example of when you take one file that's all in uppercase, which all of our processing is done, but you want your piece to be personalized in an upper lowercase. Title code, salutation build. Here's some examples of, a piece that was mailed, these are things that Polly had received in terms of how a salutation is done. Lots of times when you're dealing with house names and reactivations, usually you have a salutation already built into your database in terms of how you've been communicating with that individual previously. Outside lists, you do not have that. So you have to build a salutation if you're wanting to create one. And what would that be? Is it going to be first name? Is it going to be title, last name if you have a title? Is it just going to be the full name? Is it going to be dear friend? So, what have you learned in your communication through acquisition, through your donors, that type of thing, on what's the best way to address an individual? I see a lot of different cases. Usually, from an informal standpoint, going, to first name, do you feel like when you are reaching out to somebody you have no relationship with, is it better to be informal with them or is it better to be formal with them? That's a business decision that you have to make. So depending on what the hierarchy is on building a salutation, you make those decisions yourself on the best way to communicate that when you're building a salutation. Binder numbers and scan lines. These are ways to usually for the response companies to deal and to track the pieces so they can scan either a finder number or a scan line. You will see in the example where the arrows point, that's a scan line that's been built, usually based off of a unique sequence number that's assigned along probably with the package code, along with potentially some other information that makes up the scan line. And the response companies are dealing with scanning that. And then when they scan that, name and address data pops up, source codes, what package, all of that information to keep them from having to key in all of that data. If it's not a scannable value, then it may just be a numeric finder number, unique finder numbers assigned. All they do is type in that number and pops up the name and address data. Tips that I might have from y'all is as far as this, the merge process, understanding and knowing the history of your mailings is important, not only to you, but for your list broker, for your service provider, so that these types of anomalies that I hit on earlier, when they occur, you're aware of them. And it's not down the line that you're aware of them, you're aware of them as they're happening in real time so that you can deal with them in real time and making the best business decision that you can make before your mailings go out. So understanding history and what to expect, and when things get off track and they don't go as you expect, you have ways of digging into that and understanding exactly why that was. This is a slide that I had back from the hygiene stuff. When you're doing data hygiene, take that information from your acquisition jobs, utilize that data to update your internal databases with your NCOA moves, with your Nixies, with your deceased. If you're running PCOA, proprietary change of address, I strongly recommend that when you're updating your database, your current donors have communicated with you how they like to be communicated with, in what fashion and where and that type of thing. And my personal belief is you know your donors better than anybody else. From an outside service, if you have older names that have not communicated with you in a long time and you're doing the PCOA process, those are individuals that I would recommend that you update the database internally with the PCOA changes For the more current ones, I would recommend you flag them potentially that you got a PCOA move, but I think you should, until you've been told otherwise, or they fall into the or into the lapsed category, you continue to communicate with them as they have communicated with you in the recency that you consider your active donors. One of the last things that I'll touch on is the importance of communicating and strategizing with your partners, your list brokers, your service providers, anybody that's involved, your creative, your agencies, everybody plays a big role in everything that happens with the success of your organization, within the success of your mailings. So bring everybody together, talk about these various issues, make sure that you're communicating and that everybody understands what your goals are and what you're trying to achieve, so that their piece of the puzzle is fine-tuned to the point that it meets those objectives, that it meets those goals, and that the final product that is being produced is one that has been developed through a community of great minds coming together and offering their expertise into what's the best way to achieve those goals. And I strongly recommend that you're doing that with all your partners. Resources, Polly, do you want to jump back in here?
Certainly. Thank you, Marvin. Yes, everyone that's still on, and thank you for staying with us. We're wrapping up right now. You will be getting this training deck as well as a checklist, and we have a certificate of course completion too that we'll share with you. And of course, if you have any questions for Marvin at any time, just reach out. His contact information is here and will be in the resources that we send to you. And also just a heads up, this should say upcoming trainings, not just training. We've got two things that we're working on right now. We have how to cut your production costs to the bone, which is led by Teresa Pissarro and Leanne Doyle of PMG, and that will be on April 28th, and we'll be opening up that registration soon. And then Marvin will be back with demystifying data hygiene and Merge Purge reports and how you can use them to improve your program. So really a deep dive into some of those reports that Marvin shared with you today. And we will be announcing that date soon, and we will let you know about that. So that is it. So thank you.
Actually,
everyone.
Polly, if we can, there's a couple quick questions, Marvin, if you could address very briefly, good ones. Yeah. Knowing that DM can be a driver for online gifts, shouldn't an organization check to see how many matches are between those programs?
Yes, absolutely. And doing match backs for online donations to your acquisition is something that is becoming extremely common in our industry. Whereas they're trying to see what, have I driven somebody to the website to donate based on an acquisition piece? Did they donate not based on that, all of those types of things, and matching those back to your acquisition mailings, and then being able to tie that, because an online donation, you may end up losing the fact that, well, what list did they respond to? What package did they respond to? And getting that information tied back to a donation that was done online that you cannot necessarily track to an acquisition is something that's I find extremely valuable and provides some great information and seeing how your online programs are working.
Okay, one more quick one. If nothing jumps out in the post-merge purge reports, are there any tricks for me to verify that suppression and/or priority was done correctly?
That's a great question. The main thing, again, it kind of goes back to the history. If you were looking at your Merge Purge report and you were seeing that a specific list had no drops to the suppression file, there were no suppression matches to that particular list, or maybe there wasn't even any interaction with that list to somebody else. Again, those are red flags that our organization should be looking for and pointing those out and things that we also want, you as somebody going in and QCing and looking at to make sure and seeing if that looks unusual to you as well. The bottom line, without interrogating the data, did my suppressions work exactly the way that I want to? Did I allow for the number of variations between a name and address between this file and this file to be exactly the way that I want? Looking at reports and things of that nature, there's no real way to 100% say that your service provider did that. There's definitely a level of trust and knowledge based on the fact that we have, as an organization, interpreted everything that you've said to us in regards to your goals and your objectives. And we have studied and continue to study your data for various things that allow us to make tweaks and adjustments to the process when needed. And that you are also providing us with that feedback. As an example, you get a phone call, somebody received a piece and they said, I just donated to you. Why did I receive this piece? Providing that feedback to us for us to do some research and to say, well, one, they weren't on the suppression file. Two, they were on the suppression file, but they weren't on the suppression file at that address. And all of those different types of things. Or three, they were on the suppression file, but I see these variations within what they were mailed and how they appeared within your house suppression file. So do we want to make the adjustments to say, okay, this would be counted as a duplicate if we adjusted it for this? But also understanding that when you make adjustments one way, it has effects across the board.
One last quickie, I lied. Timing for the merge process.
Normally, you normally will be seeing merge counts within 24 to 48 hours of your cutoff.
Well, I mean scheduling. How much time should you schedule?
Oh, how much time should you schedule? Well, the first thing that you need to understand is how much time you need once you receive certain information from us to make a decision on going forward, and then either providing additional instructions such as you get the merge counts. Are you providing split instructions that same day? Do you need to get client approval? Does it take 3 or 4 days? All of those types of things need to be built into the schedule. So what I would say under most circumstances is back to cutoff date and merge counts, usually between 24 to 48 hours of that. And then you need ever how much time to create the instructions to go forward. And then from the complexity and volumes of splits and things of that nature, usually split counts will fall within that same 24 to 48 hour time frame. And then usually, another a day or two, depending on subsequent processes that are required to create output files. So under ideal circumstances, 5 business days from receipt of the last file till output usually falls under how much time to schedule for it. But again, that doesn't take into consideration internal time that you may need for evaluation or changes or things of that nature. You're also, a lot of people are using post-merge optimization files. So building that into your schedule is also important, because then you're taking the output of the merge, you're providing data to these co-ops, Abacus, Wyland, donor-based, things of that nature, where they're providing you with additional add-on names to add into that you may be using to add additional names so that you can drop others, or you may just want to fill quantity with those, and you need to include that into your schedule and account for that time as well.
Great point.
That's great. All right, I think we're going to wrap it up because it's 2:10, and we appreciate.
You got to do the trivia question so people can win a $25 gift card.
All right.
Okay, for those people who've hung with us, I see a total of 32 have. Okay, And being that it is March and we have March Madness, and actually I don't know why they call it March Madness, because around my house it's madness every single month of the year. But anyway, well that's for another day. Okay. Yes, and I had another chat. Oh no, not a sports question. Yeah, we're stuck with that. Okay, one more time, and then next time I promise they'll change. The 2 questions for $25 gift certificates, and just answer on the chat room.
And
Sorry,
if there's rapid fire responses, we're going to review the timing and we'll get back to you if you won, because we want to wrap this up quickly. Thank you.
And you can totally guess it, so it doesn't have to be, so is everything good? How many number 1 seeds are left in the men's basketball bracket? Okay, I see people responding. So that's question number 1. Question number 2, how many number 1 seeds are left in the women's basketball bracket?
All right.
Right.
I saw someone who responded 6.
I was just going to say, I think people know March Madness. I didn't see anything above 4.
Yeah.
That's great. So Wolf, thank you for hanging in there and
yes, thank you.
participating in the trivia. And again, we're going to close this up now. Thanks again, everyone. And we'll be following up soon with the resources. And also stay tuned for some upcoming trainings, and we'll let you know about those. So we're going to wrap it up. Thank you, Marvin. And thank you, John, for refereeing the questions.
Thank you, Polly. And thanks, everyone, for attending.
Yeah. Good to see everybody that's there.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye.